Hello and welcome to a Superpower Relations revision video, which is going to focus on the Cold War leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States. So this video is going to look at quite a lot of this unit of work in overview. So you really want to use this video towards the end of your revision program when you've already got a good understanding of the events in the Cold War, and maybe you're trying to work out how these things fit together. So during this video, it might be an idea to stop and pause every so often, maybe take a screenshot if there's a lot of information on a slide that you want to jot down or turn into a flashcard. So here's a slide that you might want to take a screenshot of. It shows you in outline everything that we're going to cover in this presentation. So you can see that we're dealing with a lot of information. There's over 16 Cold War leaders here. So what we're going to try to do is to group them together so you can chunk this material in your memory. So we'll build up a picture of how the leaders all fit together as we go along. So we're going to build a timeline of the Cold War leaders from 1941 up to 1991. So we'll start with the first group, and we'll look at Joseph Stalin and his contemporaries, Presidents Roosevelt and Truman. Our first Soviet leader to look at is Joseph Stalin, under whom the Cold War starts. Our big points are the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe and the beginning and intensification of the Cold War. So Joseph Stalin was a brutal dictator who had been in power in the Soviet Union since the 1920s, so he's highly experienced at the start of the Cold War. He'd led the Soviet Union through the incredible trials and difficulties of the Second World War, and at the end of the Second World War had set up a buffer zone for the Soviets in Eastern Europe. And then, as relations with the Americans and the rest of the West declined, embarked on an arms race with the USA. So key events are the wartime conferences at Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam. And then after that, we're into the Cold War period. The Long and Novikov telegrams, which signal the breakdown of relations between the superpowers. The Truman Doctrine of 1947. The Marshall Plan of 1948, both of which signal the end of America's attempts to have friendly relations with the Soviets. The First Berlin Crisis in 1948, and then in 1949 the formation of NATO and Comecon, in which Stalin attempted to build economic union for the Soviets' benefits across the Soviet satellite states. And his main American contemporaries are Roosevelt and Truman. So let's look at those presidents in a little bit of detail. So Roosevelt thought that he could manipulate Stalin. He was wrong in this, but he attempted to build warm relations with him at the conferences that he was present with him at. And then after he died and President Truman took over, his attitude was opposite. He distrusted Stalin. It's under Truman that the nuclear arms race begins and the division of Europe takes place. So we have the descent into Cold War when Truman comes to office. So that's our first group. Let's have a look at what happens next. So when Stalin died in 1953, there's a period where it's not quite clear where the power in the Soviet Union was going to land. By 1956, Nikita Khrushchev had emerged as a clear leader, and his main American contemporaries are President Eisenhower and President Kennedy. So let's have a look at this second group. So under Nikita Khrushchev, the Cold War entered its period of crisis. While in office, he attempted to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union to make some internal reforms. And initially, Khrushchev sought better relations with the West. However, in his dealings with the West, he was seen to have come off worse. We'll have a look at the crises, particularly those in Berlin and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Under Khrushchev's leadership, the Soviets also faced unrest in their satellite states, in Poland and in particular Hungary. So the key events for Khrushchev are the formation in 1945 of the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviets' response to NATO, so it's a collective defence agreement. Then the 1956 Hungarian uprising, which was quelled by force with a Soviet military intervention. The building of the Berlin Wall in 1961, which brought to a head the crisis in Berlin. And then in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the point in the Cold War when the superpowers come closest to direct nuclear confrontation with each other. And his contemporaries are Eisenhower and Kennedy. So let's look in slightly more detail at those two. So under Eisenhower, key developments are the formation of the Cold War alliances of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And it's under Eisenhower that problems around the Berlin settlement again start to surface. But it's under Kennedy that those problems become a crisis. And the two major crises that are faced are over Berlin and in particular the Cuban Missile Crisis, which take place in Kennedy's short presidency. So that's our second group. Let's have a look at our third. So our third group is Leonid Brezhnev and the US presidents Johnson, Nixon, Ford and Carter. So you can see that Brezhnev was in office for a long time. Our big points here is that his office is characterized by internal authority and continuity, and hence a lack of modernisation. So Brezhnev aimed to re-establish Soviet authority, and he enforced conformity with the Brezhnev Doctrine. But it's under him also that in the 1970s, the superpowers embark on a period of détente, of better relations. But crucially, he failed to raise living standards inside the Soviet Union in this time. And in the long term, that would be particularly damaging. So key events. You can see that in the 1960s, it is a period of relative calm. However, the Soviets did face the Prague Spring, in which Czechoslovakia made a series of reforms, and that resulted in the Brezhnev Doctrine that enforced conformity and membership of the Warsaw Pact. And in the 1970s, there are two major landmarks in the détente process: the SALT I Treaty, which limits nuclear weapons, and then in 1975 the Helsinki Accords, which were a series of diplomatic agreements around human rights, technology and borders. But that period was brought to a close with the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan, in which Brezhnev sought to counter the threat of Islamic government to the south of the USSR. And as you can see, he's in office for a long time, so he's got a lot of American contemporaries that he deals with. So let's have a look at these four presidents. So let's look firstly at President Johnson. So this is a period of relative calm in the Cold War. But this was mainly because America was diverted towards other problems. It was under Johnson that the Vietnam War became particularly costly for America, and America was also divided by its civil rights campaigns. Then it's Richard Nixon, whose presidency lasted until 1974, Nixon ended the Vietnam War and led America into the détente process. His presidency was characterized with extensive diplomacy with the Soviet Union. After Nixon left office, he was replaced with Gerald Ford, and the détente process continued, and that included, under Ford, the Helsinki Accords. And then to bring the 1970s to a close, President Carter ended the détente period. And that was particularly because the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, but there were already cracks reappearing in relations between the superpowers before that had happened. And in a lot of ways, Afghanistan just gave Carter the excuse he needed to end that period of better relations. So the SALT II treaty that the superpowers had agreed was not ratified. So let's have a look at our final group. When Brezhnev died, he was replaced by two other old Soviet leaders, Andropov and Chernenko, neither of whom were in office for very long. So we'll pick things up again in 1985 with Mikael Gorbachev. And his major contemporaries are Presidents Reagan and President Bush. So under Mikhail Gorbachev, it's a period of modernisation, of necessary modernisation after the years of stagnation in the latter years of Brezhnev. And Gorbachev sees the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to save communism with a reform program characterized with perestroika and glasnost. He entered into extensive diplomacy with President Reagan. Despite Reagan's aggressive attitude, he ended the Brezhnev Doctrine, and that brought about the end of the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, which led to the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union. So key events for Gorbachev are his new thinking of glasnost and perestroika, reform and openness, diplomacy with Reagan leading to the INF Treaty in 1987, and at the end of the decade, the collapse of the satellite states and the fall of the Berlin Wall, when Gorbachev made clear that the Soviet Union would no longer prop up or support communist regimes in Eastern Europe. And then in 1991, the Warsaw Pact itself was dissolved, as was the Soviet Union at the end of the year, and that marked the end of the Cold War. His contemporary presidents are Reagan and Bush. So let's have a look at these two. And in particular, we'll have a look at Reagan. So Ronald Reagan was hostile in his dealings initially with the Soviet Union. His rhetoric was harsh and extreme. So this launched America and the Soviet Union into a second Cold War. A key policy for Reagan was the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, or Star Wars, which aimed to win the Cold War for the USA technologically. And in the mid-1980s, he enters a period of diplomacy with Gorbachev. And then right at the end, we've got President Bush, who oversees the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the satellite states, and the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union. So we've covered a lot of ground there. To apply this content, why not do some retrieval practice? Maybe do a brain dump for each of the leaders that we've covered. Maybe write their names, give yourself a set time, and write as much as you can remember about their time in office. Thanks for watching. The material that we've covered in this video is covered in lots more detail in other videos on the CHSG History YouTube channel.